When my parents said we were broke, took my grandma's money, and made me feel like a burden. But at my graduation dinner, one sentence changed everything. The dining room smelled like baked rosemary and polished wood, but underneath it all, I could sense something sour beginning to rise. My graduation dinner had started as a carefully staged photo op. Roses we couldn't afford, champagne we had no business opening, and fake laughter bouncing off every corner of our home in Savannah. My mother Nora fluttered around in a navy dress that still had a price tag tucked under her sleeve, and my father Graham was pouring wine into glasses like a man auditioning for a part he didn't understand. It had taken me 4 years of working 2 jobs, skipping meals, and wearing the same 3 pairs of jeans until the hem shredded just to get my degree. But tonight, they played the proud parents in a film they'd written themselves. I sat there, watching them perform. I wasn't angry yet, just numb. And then my grandmother, May, leaned across the table with her usual grace, eyes locked on me with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. "I'm so glad the money helped, Savannah," she said. "1,800 every month adds up. But at least you didn't have to worry about groceries while studying." The fork froze in my hand. Conversation stopped around me. My cousin Joe actually choked on a piece of sourdough. For a second, I thought I'd misheard her. "What money?" I asked slowly, my eyes drifting to my parents. May smiled, confused, as if I were joking. "The money I've been sending since you started at Briarstone, every month. For books, food, housing, everything." My heartbeat thudded in my ears. I looked at my mother. Her smile had vanished, her fingers tightening around her wine glass until it trembled. My father shifted in his seat, eyes scanning the table like he was hunting for a distraction. Neither of them said a word. "I've never received a single cent," I said, louder than I meant to. The room dropped 10 degrees. The only sound was my uncle setting his glass down too hard. My mother opened her mouth, her voice shaky and sweet. "Savannah, darling, I think this is something we should talk about later." "No, we're talking about it now," May said, and her tone, usually buttersoft, cut like glass. The silence twisted tighter. My mother reached for her performance mode, trying to laugh it off. "It must be a mistake. A banking error or, Graham, didn't we say we'd set up the account?" May's lips pressed into a thin line. "There's no mistake. I transferred funds every month, always with confirmation. I kept every receipt. I couldn't breathe. I had been rationing painkillers when my jaw infection got so bad I couldn't sleep. I'd skipped spring break 3 years in a row. I'd worked 16-hour shifts during finals just to afford printer ink. They told me we had nothing to spare. They told me to be grateful they weren't taking out loans in their own names. They told me this was what sacrifice looked like. What about the time I couldn't get to class for 2 weeks because my car died and you said we were tapped out?" I asked, my voice shaking. "What about when I needed antibiotics and you told me to wait it out with teas and sleep?" Nora's mouth opened again, this time armed with a carefully rehearsed lie. "We were saving it for something bigger. For your future. Bigger than medicine? Bigger than food." May stood slowly, pushing her chair back with the soft scrape of wood. Her expression had shifted completely. Gone was the affectionate pride, replaced with something harder and colder. "I'll be staying at the Gardenia in downtown," she said to me, not to them. "Room 214. Come when you're ready." Then she left, coat thrown over her arm like a general exiting a battlefield. My mother tried to rescue the dinner. She begged everyone to stay. My father announced we needed to toast again, but the magic was gone. My aunt said they needed to get on the road before traffic. My cousin pretended to get a call from work. Plates were still half full when the door shut behind the last guest. That night, I sat in my childhood bedroom surrounded by glow-in-the-dark stars my father once put on the ceiling when I was 8. I'd always believed I was the poor girl with supportive but struggling parents. Turns out I was their bank account. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Something inside me had shifted permanently. The next morning, I packed a bag and left before either of them woke up. Grandma didn't say much when she opened the door of her room at the Gardenia Inn. She didn't need to. There was a full breakfast already waiting: toast, soft-boiled eggs, a pot of black coffee, and 2 chairs angled toward the sunlight. She simply gestured for me to sit, poured coffee into two mismatched porcelain cups, and waited. "I should have checked with you directly years ago," she said after a long pause. "But your mother always told me you were too busy to talk, that you were thriving, that you'd outgrown family distractions." I could hear the regret in her voice, a bitter edge that cut deeper than I expected. I told her everything I remembered. The missed school trips, the skipped doctor appointments, the broken winter coat I kept sewing back together until it barely resembled fabric. Grandma listened, her knuckles white around her coffee cup. Then she reached into her handbag and pulled out a leather folder, unbuckled it, and slid a stack of printed bank statements across the table. Each page had dates, amounts, transfer confirmations from her account to one labeled S. Reed College account. "This is every deposit," she said. "From the summer before you started school until last month. $1,800 per month, never late." I flipped through the pages, my hands trembling. The total added up to over $86,000. Money that should have kept me from ever having to work midnight shifts cleaning frat houses. Money that could have paid for a therapist when my panic attacks got so bad I couldn't sleep. Money that could have let me be a college student instead of a ghost haunting the edges of everyone else's fun. "How?" I whispered. "How did they get away with this?" Grandma didn't blink. "Because we trusted them. Because you were a child. And because they made sure no one got too close." That night, I went back to my apartment, pulled out my laptop, and opened my bank account. Nothing stood out. Just the usual mess of small transfers, paycheck deposits, and bills. Then I called the bank directly. "I need to know if there are any accounts under my name that I can't see," I said after confirming my identity. The representative paused before replying. "Yes, ma'am. There's a joint account opened 8 years ago. You and Nora Reed." "I never opened a joint account with my mother," I said, already knowing what had happened. "Can you tell me when it was created?" "June 2014, the voice replied. "Shortly after your 17th birthday." I stared at the wall for a long time after that. When I finally texted my cousin Lyra, I didn't explain. I just said, "I need to talk." "About our parents." She responded in seconds. "Finally figured it out? Call me." I hadn't seen Lyra in over a year. When we talked, it was like a dam burst open. She told me everything: how her college fund from our grandfather disappeared, how her parents said it had lost value in the market, and how she'd been shut out of family gatherings for asking questions. I hadn't realized how far my parents had gone to isolate me. Every person they claimed had drifted away, every friend who moved on, had actually been edged out by subtle comments, sly guilt trips, and cold silences. Lyra told me about Uncle Julian too, the one we'd been told was unstable and toxic. She said he tried to step in years ago, after questioning the way my father handled our grandmother's estate. Suddenly, he wasn't invited to holidays. Letters he sent went unanswered. Gifts returned. I felt like a fool, remembering how many times I'd defended them. The next day, Grandma set up a meeting with her lawyer, a woman named Carol who specialized in financial fraud and estate violations. She was calm, clinical, and looked at me the way a surgeon might look at a patient before an operation, not unkindly, but with the full weight of what was ahead. "With what you've shown me," she said, flipping through the documentation, "we're looking at theft, fraud, and forgery. And if your signature was used to open that joint account at 17, that adds a layer of criminal activity." The word fraud made me flinch. It sounded so formal, so public, but it fit. I'd spent years believing I was a financial burden, when the truth was, I was their retirement plan. After the meeting, we sat in the courtyard outside Carol's office. The jasmine blooming along the fence filled the air with a sweetness that didn't match the nausea twisting in my gut. "I keep thinking about every time I apologized for needing things," I said to May. "They made me feel like I was asking too much when I just wanted to eat or sleep without pain." May's eyes filled, but she didn't cry. She just placed her hand over mine and nodded. We made a plan. I would gather all the evidence I could: my tax returns, financial aid applications, old emails about tight times. Everything I'd been told was proof that we were struggling. Carol would initiate the first legal steps and request a freeze on any accounts associated with my name. We'd meet again in a week to begin formal proceedings. That night, back in my apartment, I sat on the floor surrounded by my old notebooks and birthday cards. I found one from my 17th birthday, signed with a smiley face from Grandma, but the check she'd included was never cashed. My mother had told me it bounced, that I should be understanding. Every memory started clicking into place. The guilt trips, the emotional manipulation, the stories about how hard they were working to support me, all while using my name to drain money they never earned. I opened a new folder on my desktop and titled it Proof. Then I picked up my phone and called Uncle Julian. Julian met me at a quiet cafe on the edge of town, far enough from familiar eyes, but close enough for comfort. He was older than I remembered, but his presence was steady, like a door I hadn't known was still open. The first thing he did was apologize, not for leaving, but for not fighting harder to stay connected. I wrote you every birthday, he said as he passed me a small, weathered envelope. Inside were copies of letters I'd never seen, addressed to me in a familiar block print. Your mom returned them all, said you didn't want anything to do with me. I sat there, stunned, realizing how wide the distance had truly been. Julian told me everything. About the time he'd challenged Graham over missing funds from their mother's estate. About how he'd been painted as unstable, how he was uninvited from everything that followed. About how he suspected something darker was going on, but never had proof. Until now. I showed him the documents Carol had reviewed, the statements, the forged account paperwork. He shook his head slowly, exhaling like someone finally letting go of a weight they'd carried too long. You have to fight this, he said. They won't stop otherwise. The next morning, the text started. My mother, in her usual syrupy tone, wanted to talk like adults. She claimed there had been a misunderstanding, that maybe there were some mistakes, and that I was blowing things out of proportion. She asked if we could meet for dinner. Just the three of us. I didn't respond. Later that evening, she showed up unannounced at my apartment. I saw her through the peephole before she even knocked. Red-rimmed eyes, perfect hair, that cardigan she wore whenever she needed to look vulnerable. I didn't open the door. Instead, I slid my phone into my pocket and walked to the window, where I could see her pacing, her phone in one hand, her other clutched to her chest. She stood there for 10 minutes, pretending to cry, and then left. By the weekend, news had spread. People I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly reached out. Some were supportive, saying they'd always suspected something was off. Others were colder, confused why I'd turn against my own parents. The rumor mill in Savannah never needed much to spin, and now it was churning full force. The narrative was simple. I was the ungrateful daughter. I was attacking my family out of spite. My parents, of course, were the victims. Meanwhile, Ren, my boyfriend of almost a year, finally weighed in. His message was longer than expected, but the content didn't surprise me. Are you sure this is worth the fight? He wrote. They're still your family. Maybe they had their reasons. Things are complicated. You've got a future ahead of you. Don't waste it on the past. I stared at that message for a long time, then deleted it without replying. That night, May found me on her balcony, knees pulled to my chest, a blanket wrapped tightly around my shoulders. Ren thinks I should let it go, I told her. Her response was immediate, sharp. Then Ren doesn't understand what it means to have something stolen and still be told to say thank you. A few days later, Carol filed the official fraud complaint. We were moving forward, slowly, carefully, but definitely. The next legal step was an emergency hearing to prevent further withdrawals from any joint account. Meanwhile, the forensic team had begun tracing the missing funds. Carol said we were uncovering patterns, transfers to secondary accounts, luxury purchases hidden under business expenses, even shell contributions to vacation rentals. They didn't just steal from you, she told me. They built an entire life with your money and made you feel guilty for needing shoes. The hearing date was set for the following Thursday. When we entered the courtroom, my mother wore gray, her face soft and carefully painted. My father had shaved, wearing the same suit he wore to church, and beside them sat a lawyer with a practiced smirk and a folder full of denials. I felt sick, but I stood tall. The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes, reviewed the documents with clinical focus. When it came time to speak, Carol stepped forward, laying out our evidence, the bank records, the forged account setup, May's statements, the tracking of funds. Then, the judge looked at me. Would you like to make a statement? I stood, legs trembling slightly, and read from the paper I'd rewritten 3 times the night before. "I'm not here today because of a single mistake," I said. "I'm here because of a years-long deception that made me believe I was a financial burden when, in fact, I was being used. My education, my health care, my dignity, they were all sacrificed under the illusion of scarcity, while money that was meant to help me was spent behind my back. And when I asked questions, I was shamed into silence. When I sat down, the room was quiet. My parents' lawyer asked for dismissal, claiming the issue was a misunderstanding within the family and that a public case would only cause irreparable harm. He said we were blowing things out of proportion. He said they had only acted in their daughter's best interest. The judge denied the motion. "Discovery will proceed," she said firmly, "and a forensic audit will begin immediately." Outside, reporters had gathered. May guided me past them, her arm strong around my shoulders. "You were brilliant," she whispered. "And now, we begin." After the hearing, something inside me shifted. It wasn't relief exactly, but a kind of clarity that made it easier to breathe. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying the weight of pretending everything was fine. I moved out of my apartment near campus and spent the summer living with May in her Victorian house on the edge of town, the one I hadn't visited since middle school. The space felt like stepping into a version of my life that had been locked away: framed photos, old books, creaky floorboards, and the scent of lavender in every room. We kept busy. While forensic accountants followed the paper trail behind closed doors, May and I worked on building something forward-facing. I started journaling again, not just for therapy, but to document everything. Each memory I recorded sharpened my understanding of how calculated everything had been. The stories I'd believed for years about why we couldn't afford doctor visits, school trips, or even birthday parties, all of them unraveling. May suggested I talk to her friend from her bridge club, a retired therapist named Adele who specialized in trauma from familial betrayal. I met with her twice, then 3 times, until it became a regular part of my week. With Adele's help, I stopped apologizing for feeling angry. I stopped minimizing what had been done to me. She said something during one of our sessions that stayed with me. "Abuse wrapped in love still counts as abuse. The packaging doesn't change the damage." While staying at May's, I launched a podcast, not because I wanted to become some kind of activist, but because I needed a place to speak freely. I called it Beneath the Balance, and in each episode, I shared pieces of my story alongside anonymous stories submitted by others. I interviewed a few guests, therapists, lawyers, and other survivors who had faced similar betrayals. It grew slowly, then suddenly caught fire after a national financial columnist tweeted about it. One day, a message appeared in my inbox from a girl named Lila in Michigan. She was 16, working part-time at a bakery, and her parents were taking her entire paycheck for bills. After listening to my podcast, she confronted her guidance counselor, who helped her open a new account with an aunt she hadn't seen in years. "You gave me the courage to speak up," she wrote. "I didn't think anyone else would understand." I stared at that message for a long time, tears falling silently. In early August, May and I received a settlement offer. My parents, through their new lawyer, proposed to repay half the stolen money with no admission of guilt. They called it a gesture of goodwill. Carol, my attorney, barely contained her disgust. "This is a tactic," she said. "They're hoping you'll be too tired to keep fighting." I declined immediately. The following week, the results from the forensic audit came in. May and I sat in Carol's office, staring at the breakdown in silence. The numbers confirmed what we already knew, but with more brutality than I'd expected. More than $91,000 of my grandmother's intended support had been funneled through layered transfers, disguised purchases, and fake reimbursements. There were receipts for luxury items, online investments, and even a cruise. I remembered the cruise. They told me it was comped through Graham's job. Apparently, I'd paid for it. Carol looked up from the paperwork. "This strengthens your case for damages," she said. "And if we proceed, we'll be in a position to claim emotional distress, not just restitution." We moved forward. That weekend, Ren showed up at May's porch unannounced. He had a nervous energy, shifting from foot to foot, holding a wrapped package like an apology in box form. I met him outside, told him he could speak, but not for long. "I've been thinking," he started. "I was wrong. You're not overreacting." I just didn't know how to handle it. I told him that fear is understandable, but cowardice dressed as neutrality still hurts just as much. He said he missed me. I said I didn't miss feeling unsupported. When he left, I didn't watch him go. Around that time, I received a call from an old English professor, Dr. Sinclair. She had read about the case through local news coverage and invited me to speak at a university panel on financial literacy and family power dynamics. I was hesitant, unsure if my story belonged in a classroom. But I said yes anyway. Standing at the front of that lecture hall, looking out at dozens of students who reminded me of who I'd been just months ago, I didn't use notes. I spoke from the same place that had launched the podcast, from exhaustion, from grief, and finally from conviction. Sometimes, the people who teach you to fear money are the ones who want control over your access to it. They don't take it all at once. They take your sense of independence, your sense of reality, and your ability to believe you deserve more. When it ended, several students stayed behind. One girl told me she'd always wondered why her parents insisted on managing her bank account even after she turned 20. Another said he hadn't realized that guilt could be weaponized to create dependency. I walked out of the building feeling something I hadn't in years, useful. Later that evening, May made dinner, cornbread, blackened catfish, and greens, and we sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the trees. "You've come so far," she said, placing her hand on mine. "And I'm not just proud, I'm lucky to be part of this with you." As the summer faded into fall, I received one final envelope from Carol. The trial date was set. It would happen within 6 weeks. No more delays, no more maneuvering. We had all the evidence, all the testimony, and the full backing of the court. May looked across the table at me. "No matter what happens in that courtroom," she said, "you've already won back your name." The morning of the trial, the sky over Savannah cracked open with rain. It poured steadily, like the world was washing something off itself. May and I arrived early, sitting in the courthouse parking lot for a long moment before going inside. I was calm, surprisingly so. The fear had burned away weeks ago, replaced with something denser, like armor made of everything I'd survived. Inside the courtroom, my parents sat stiffly behind their lawyer, their expressions curated for sympathy. My mother wore a pale blue blouse that made her look fragile. My father had grown a beard, probably to appear older, softer, more respectable. They avoided my eyes. I didn't need them to look. I wasn't there for their recognition. The case opened with Carol's presentation, the stolen funds, the forged documents, the fake account, the receipts of cruises and purchases I had never benefited from. She didn't embellish, didn't pause for drama, just the truth laid out piece by piece, clean and undeniable. When the judge asked if I wished to speak, I stood slowly, holding the pages of my prepared statement. But I didn't read from them. "I used to think being part of a family meant forgiveness by default," I said, my voice steady, "that love required silence, that enduring harm was somehow proof of loyalty. But now I understand something else. Real love doesn't demand invisibility. It doesn't ask you to sacrifice your needs for someone else's comfort. I didn't lose a family. I lost a lie pretending to be one." The silence that followed wasn't heavy, it was clear, like something had finally finished breaking. The trial concluded faster than expected. The evidence was too strong, the pattern too clear. The judge ruled in my favor, full restitution plus damages for emotional harm. My parents didn't even look at each other as the decision was read. I don't know if that made it better or worse. 2 weeks later, I used part of the settlement to move out of Georgia. I found a modest apartment in Asheville, not far from May, who now lived in a small rented cottage on the edge of town. It was quiet, wooded, and far from the weight of the past. I repainted the walls myself and bought furniture piece by piece, paying in cash. Everything in that space was mine. The podcast grew rapidly after the trial. Listeners from across the country began writing in. Some had similar stories. Some were just beginning to ask questions. Others wanted to know how to heal from a truth they couldn't yet face. I responded to every message, even the difficult ones. Then, late one night, an envelope arrived in my mailbox. No return address. Just my name, written in an unfamiliar hand. Inside was a single-page letter and a flash drive. The letter was typed and signed. "You were right to go public," it began. "You were also right not to trust everything that's been said. Your parents weren't working alone. There's more. The account in your name was only the start. I plugged the flash drive into my laptop. What I found made my stomach twist. Scans of account ledgers, notes about additional accounts, and, most chilling, 3 recent withdrawals from a different account still registered under my name. Each withdrawal had happened in the last month. Each one had occurred after the settlement. That account, I'd never opened. The flash drive also included an audio recording someone, I didn't recognize the voice, talking to what sounded like a bank clerk. They were using my name, confirming my old social security number, asking to change the phone number on file. I felt cold all over. Someone was still using my identity. Someone had waited until the dust settled, until I believed it was over, and they were still draining from what they hadn't earned. The next morning, I called the bank. I filed a fraud report. I froze all accounts under my name. But that wasn't the worst part. That afternoon, I received an anonymous message through the podcast site. "You should have stayed silent," it read. Nothing else. May was already on her way to my apartment when I called. She stayed the night without asking. We didn't speak much, but I could tell she was watching me, measuring my reaction, my calm, my fear. That night, as we sat on the porch listening to the cicadas and wind, she finally asked, "Do you think it's over?" I wanted to say yes. I wanted to believe the court, the judgment, the money, the documents had sealed it all away. But in my chest, something felt unfinished. "I think it's just changing form," I said quietly. 2 days later, Carol called with updates. She traced the new activity back to a secondary shell account created during the time the joint account existed, this one accessed by someone who'd worked at my father's company. A man named Ruben, who used to be their financial consultant. Someone who'd known how to hide things. And someone who'd just vanished from his last known address. The police were now involved. The case, once personal and contained, had opened wider. Later that week, I received a final piece of mail, a postcard with no stamp. Just a handwritten message on the back. "You may have won the court, but the rest of us are still here." I showed it to May. She didn't say anything, but her hands tightened around her tea. So I installed cameras. I bought a safe. I changed my phone number. I started using 2-factor authentication for everything. And I kept recording my podcast. Not because I wasn't scared, but because fear wasn't going to decide my story anymore. There was still more to uncover, more to say, more silence that needed breaking. Whatever came next, I'd be ready.